following talk I gave at Xavier University to students studying STEM, and the theme of the talk is pretty much how to figure out what to do with your life and how to design a career in STEM. Here for the first time, my name is Ali. I'm a PhD student in electrical engineering, and I've done a few electrical engineering internships, including 2 at NASA, and I'm currently doing 1 at MIT. But I'd like to think that I at least know a little bit of what I'm talking about when it comes to career design or career development, or just overall figuring out what to do with your life if you are someone studying STEM or engineering. And I really think that if you watch the next 40 minutes, you're going to be an absolute superstar in STEM and in engineering, so let's go ahead. All right, ignoring that, hi everyone, my name is Ali. I might as well start with the slide that actually introduces who I am. So when anybody gives you a presentation, it's probably good to ask, like, who is this person? Why should I listen to him? So I'm going to start with this. So I'll tell you who I am, why I'm here. So who I am currently a PhD student. I graduated with my bachelor's in electrical engineering about 4 years ago. Then I did a master's, and now I'm doing my PhD. I'm graduating sometime this year. I went to University of Buffalo for my undergrad, and then I'm currently going to Northeastern for my PhD. And throughout my journey, I've done about 6 internships. I'm probably about to do the 7th one. And if you're wondering why you're doing so many internships, I'll talk about that later. I worked at Northrop Grumman Space Systems 3 times, where I worked on satellite communications, basically making satellites talk to each other and making sure all that is going well. I worked at the NASA Kennedy Space Center, where I basically was building electronics that were being put on a rover that will hopefully go to the moon sometime soon. I also worked at the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where I worked on some electronics for stuff that they're going to put on a balloon for a telescope, because balloons are cheaper than satellites, so sometimes you can get away with that. And then I also worked at another company called TTM Technologies, where I did some more circuit design and radio frequency stuff. I also lived in Spain for about 6 months, and I studied there for a little bit, even though I didn't go to class, because if you're studying abroad, you should not go to class. You should go do all the other fun stuff. I also lived at the California Institute of Technology for a bit on an exchange program, and that was awesome, because their dorms were like pretty weird. It was like Harry Potter, where they divide you in like little groups, and people were like really weird in a good way. I also wrote a book that documented everything I've done as an undergrad. Don't worry, I'm not selling it to you. You can find it online if you're somebody who's interested in engineering on my website. And basically the book just talks about how to choose like your major in engineering. Okay, cool, if you want to be an electrical engineer, awesome. How do you choose a specialty? How do you get an internship? How do you do all that fun stuff? Should you go to grad school? We'll talk about that a little bit. I've also done a bunch of other things. I've worked in private, public companies. I've done undergraduate, graduate research. I tutored, I taught. I studied and I taught English abroad as well. I love teaching. And then I also did some advocacy stuff for education, working with students and whatnot. But more important than any of that, I was on a quest throughout the whole time I was in college, and that is, what do I do with my life? What do I do with my career? How do I choose my career? How do I actually pick something that is meaningful? And through a very rigorous process, which I'm going to share with you, I actually figured it out. And I'm guessing that's what you guys want as well, right? You probably have the question in the back of your head, I'm paying so much money for college. What am I going to do with this degree? Where is this going to lead me, right? And that's probably something that's in the back of your head. If that's not in the back of your head, I don't know what you're doing, because you're spending a lot of money being here, so you probably should do something with it. So I may look like something that's very impressive, but this has not always been the case at all. I was actually a mess. I'm still a mess, but not as much as I used to be. But my whole life, up until college, really, I was just extremely confused. And I spent so much time, even undergrad, not really doing my necessary work, not doing what I'm supposed to do. Instead, I was like seeing people, trying to figure things out, hanging out with people, playing video games. And even in high school, I was ranked 118th out of 517. So that's definitely not very impressive. And a lot of my teachers said, okay, you're going to go absolutely nowhere. Because I was basically daydreaming instead of doing the work. And I had no idea what to do with my life. So basically the biggest transition happened when I didn't know what to do with my life, and then I knew what to do with my life. And that's basically what the theme of this presentation is going to be, sharing with you how that process actually happened, and how it was actually STEM, or scientific thinking, that led that to actually happen. Now, I wasn't that bad in high school and undergrad. Like, I would at least productively procrastinate and read science fiction books. I would watch movies, and I would watch a lot of movies. I would basically get inspiration from movies on how to actually go about life. And it turns out I actually had superpower that I didn't know about the whole time. And I started putting it to use. And once I started putting it to use and figured out what I was actually doing, everything changed. And basically, I'm here to share that superpower. And it's not necessarily as fancy as you think. It's something so simple, but once you focus in on it and apply it rigorously in your life, it kind of changes everything forever. So, before we talk about superpowers, and I talk a little bit more about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, we're all here studying STEM, right? We're all studying science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We're science people, but why? Like, why STEM? And why did you major in STEM? And if I were to guess, there could be many reasons. You probably like math and science. You may have heard that like STEM will get you a good job. You might think that it will lead you to a stable career. You might have family members in STEM. Somebody told you like STEM is the future, which could be. Or you could actually want to make a difference and contribute to innovation, right? You'd probably see like so much changes happening in technology, and you're like, okay, I want to be part of that, right? So there could be many reasons why you're here, but the real benefit of STEM is none of the things that were listed in the bullets. It's actually something a lot more profound, and that is the superpower that I figured it out. And that is when you're studying STEM and you really understand what it's like to actually be in the sciences, you start thinking like a scientist. And when you start thinking like a scientist and you apply that thinking to all areas in your life, especially how you design your career and how you go about your business, things change. Now let's track back a little bit. What is science? Science really is defined by the scientific method, and we're probably all familiar with the scientific method, which is you make an observation, you look at something and you're like, okay, why are things the way they are? And you're like, I think this is what's happening. So you make a hypothesis, and then you're like, okay, let me go figure it out. You go do something, you arrive at a conclusion, and then you document your results. Now, you don't stop there. Like, a bad scientist would stop there. A good scientist would pick right up and say, okay, now that I've documented the result, why is this result like this? And then you start with the question again, you make another hypothesis, you run another experiment, you arrive at a different conclusion, and then by the other conclusion, you document your result, and things have changed a little bit. And then you don't stop there. You go through the same process again and again and again, and you go through this loop many, many times until you come to some aha moment, and that's where things change. For example, this is like where Einstein would come across the result of his like thought experiment and discover something like relativity, or there's something like where Michael Faraday thought about electromagnetics and finally arrived at a conclusion. It was through this rigorous loop. So, okay, STEM is important, scientific method is important. It's good to keep that in mind. So then the other aspect of this presentation is career development, right? So why is a career important, right? And that one's a lot simpler. I mean, when you think of a career, like it's your work, it's whatever you're gonna do, whatever you're on this earth, spending your time doing, you probably want to contribute something, you probably want to have an impact, you probably want to do something meaningful, since work is probably gonna be the thing you're doing for the rest of your life. So why not make that something meaningful? And if you're ambitious, you want to leave your ding on the universe. But the reality is that career development is important, not only for these reasons, but something, again, even more profound, and that is your career is really just a mirror of like you as a person, right? Like if you go to any new city or new place, very often, very first thing we'll ask is, what do you do? And that's how people will define you and box you. Not that people should label you and box you, but that's just the reality, is that what you do for a living, or what you spend most of your time doing, is what you spend most of your time thinking about. And that's probably why your career is something that matters, is because it's really a reflection of who you are. So one way to think about career development is personal development. Like every second you spend thinking about your career and challenges you have to overcome in your career to get the career you want or to do something meaningful, you're actually holding a mirror and you're looking at yourself, right? You're like, what do I want? What actions need to happen for me to get what I want? And what type of person gets those things that I want? And then you're holding a mirror and you're like, okay, am I that type of person? Yes, no. So this is basically why I think Basically, this is a very long introduction on why you should care about this presentation. So I hope you care by now. So the question now becomes, based on everything else I've mentioned, how can we use scientific method as a tool for personal development and subsequently for career development in STEM, right? So we started out thinking we're STEM majors, we want to focus on our career, but then we actually deviated in thinking, okay, that probably means we need to think about who we are, what kind of things we do. Now, how can we actually apply science to figure that out, which if we figure out the personal stuff, we'll figure out the career stuff, and we'll figure out how to make the most out of STEM. So it's kind of all mixed in together. And in other words, how do you actually think like a scientist? And how do you live? How do you use science as a framework to live your life and not just something that you do for a few hours a day and then go home, call it a day? And for that, there's a magic word. And can anybody guess the magic word? It's going to be very random, but okay. Passion? Remember, this is science. Passion is not a very scientific concept. So the magic word is iterate. And iterate, basically, is the magic word. And you're probably like, what? What does that even mean? What does iterate even mean? And before I continue, people have figured this out a long time ago, what iteration is. And they've used it. People in the Silicon Valley, in startups, there's a very good book, it's called The Lean Startup. If you read it, the book basically introduces this concept where the author basically talks about how he came up with an idea for a company, and he spent 6 months writing code for it, and then after 6 months, nobody cared enough, right? Because he failed to iterate. So when you iterate, you come up with the idea, again, going back to the scientific method, you're like, okay, let me do this thing, let's see if it works or it doesn't work. It most likely fails, and then you're like, okay, why did it fail? You arrive at a conclusion, and then you apply the same thing again. But when you apply the same thing again, you change something, right? You pick a variable and you change it. And people in the military, they figured this out as well. And they invented or came up with this Uda Loop idea. And that's basically observe, orient, decide, act. And that's really just the same scientific method loop over and over again, which is like, okay, observe, take a look at the situation, figure out where you stand, make a decision, execute it. Based on how that went, go back to the same thing, and so on. So how does iteration actually apply to what we're talking about? And how does iterate a word that's actually going to help you in your career? Now, iteration trumps theory. So science is actually all about theory, but I'm here to tell you that like the very pure science, or like the actual way to think like a scientist, is not to get too lost or obsessed with a theory, and to actually go and try to figure things out by doing things, and then based on that, you figure things out. So you don't get lost in theory too much. Now, iteration actually also teaches you reality, because we're all kind of, especially younger people, we're idealistic in very good ways, but sometimes very bad ways. And if you theorize too much, but you don't go out and do the thing that you think is going on, you don't really learn what reality looks like. So the more you try things and iterate, the more you actually understand reality. Now, this is very important, is that iteration overcomes emotions, is when you adopt this loop idea of thinking that, okay, I'm going to try this as an experiment. It may or it may not work, but what I'm interested in is actual results rather than attachment to what's going to happen. Your emotions kind of go away. It's actually, I mean, if you, like for example, go and try to talk to a girl, and you're like, okay, don't mess up, don't mess up, don't mess up. You have this attachment to the outcome, you're probably going to mess up. Or if you just go and talk to them and you're like, okay, I don't care what's going to happen, you're focused on just doing a thing, you'll probably end up doing really well. And this is the same idea of iterations. When you focus more on the process rather than be so attached to, oh, this has to happen, this has to go perfectly, all that stuff goes away. And this is why iteration cures overthinking, is because instead of thinking too much about, oh, what if this happens, what if that happens, you just go and do the thing, and you figure out what happens, right? And then, okay, if things don't work out, you iterate, and so on. But finally, iteration requires action. And this is why it's not very common, or it's not very obvious, because it's, like, action requires effort, and most people would rather not do that. Most people would rather just kind of daydream and just think, oh, I may do that, I may not do that. But the reality is, this is the only way to move forward. So to kind of go back to that and connect it, if you can identify a goal, execute with speed, you win, right? The faster you go through this loop, the more you iterate. What I used to do my whole life, up until I kind of figured out this framework, is I would observe and orient, and I would spend ages trying to decide, right? Like I remember when I was in high school, I spent like a whole year thinking, oh, what should I major in? What should I major in? What should I do? What should I do? What should I do? And I would just kind of sit and think about it all day. And guess what? Nothing happened because I just kept more thoughts getting induced. But then when I went to college, I changed my approach towards a little bit later, and I said, okay, I'm gonna pick this major, and if it doesn't work out, I'm gonna try my best, and if it doesn't work out, I'll just switch my major. And that's what I did. I switched my major 4 times. So I really applied this religiously, and it ended up being perfectly okay. And the more you can apply this kind of scientific iteration thinking in anything you do in terms of job, career, school, the more things will happen faster, right? And we're going to give some examples of how this actually happens. So now that we have iteration in mind, magic word, how do you actually apply in college, right? So you guys are all college students, so am I. How do you actually take everything I just told you, which sounds really cool and fancy, and actually apply it in the things you're doing, whether it's like classes or whatnot? And there's 2 levels to this. Level 1 is light bulb, and that is, if you are at level 1, you're basically trying to scatter your focus and look around and absorb as much as possible. And this is basically if you're somebody who still don't really know what you're doing, like you still have no idea, you're interested in like so many different things, probably a good idea to apply the following, which is find few things of value that you enjoy or at least interested in, do your research, experiment, eliminate the ones you don't like, expose yourself to new things, repeat. So you basically want to be a sponge, and you want to go attend like all talks like this. You want to go to attend as many meetings as possible. You want to go talk to as many people as possible. You want to go take classes from other majors and see, okay, maybe this, I like that, maybe I don't like that. Once you have that figured out, or at least once you, like, let's say, declare a major, or like think you're going in a certain direction, and obviously with this whole repeat, that's the iteration part, is try to apply that. If you apply that with speed, that would be really cool. But then laser 2 is when you have figured it out, but now all of a sudden things have gotten really hard, and you're like, okay, what is going on? But the reality is you have to be laser focused on what you're doing. And once you're doing that, you basically need to, like again, like let's say for example you identified that, okay, I'm gonna study physics, right? You don't just stop there. You want to take that same loop mentality and apply it to physics. And for example, you want to find fun ways to learn it, you want to be really good at it, you want to find like-minded people, you want to teach it to other people, and you iterate on each one of these things, right? Like for example, if I'm studying physics and I'm a junior, and I don't have an area that I'm interested in within physics, I'm going to probably try to talk to other physics students. And if I run into the first guy and he's like, hey man, I don't know what you're talking about, don't talk to me, I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to iterate. I'm going to go talk to someone else. I'm going to go talk to someone else, and he's going to teach me about electromagnetic physics. I'd be like, okay, I think this is cool. And now my reality has changed. My knowledge of physics has changed. And I'm going to iterate again. I'm going to go talk to someone else who does classical mechanics. And I'm going to be like, okay, what do you do? What are things going on? And so on. And you're basically still, but the thing is you're laser focused on the physics, but you're still applying the iteration to actually learn and get better. And more important than just figuring out what to do major-wise, you want to get real-world practical experience. So the reality is college, like university environment, is like a simulation, right? Like this is kind of not very real, right? The classes you take, everything you're going through here, even the interactions with people, it's kind of like very carefully designed in a way to give you the optimal experience. But the real world is not like that. The real world is like very harsh, right? Like when you go to companies and you try to do physics rather than, for example, if you're doing physics in school, no longer are you solving a problem for like, I don't know, a rocket going in the air or like a block sliding down some ramp and you have to calculate. Like all of a sudden you're thinking about other things. And once you actually have that interface with the real world, your thinking will start to change. And again, without that interaction with the real world, you're probably going to graduate and not know what you're doing. So understand why you should get an internship. Getting an internship is very important. An internship can mean many things. It could be like an apprenticeship, where you could go work for someone for free, even if you don't have other opportunities, or you could go for a company and you can get paid to like work on a little project. But when you're doing an internship, your job really is not just to do the work and go home. Your job is to keep in mind what you want to do and keep the loop in your mind, and you're like, okay, in this internship, who do I talk to? Who do I ask for help? How do I get this thing actually going? And so on. And once you do that, you'll come back to the university after having done your internship, and you'll look at everything very differently. So understanding why you need to get an internship is very important. You should get an internship, and in order to get an internship, you probably should build skills to attract the recruiters. So if I'm working at Tesla or if I'm working at NASA, and I look at your resume, I have to see something that's of interest. Now you might think, okay, Ali, I don't have any experience, and these people require experience. So how am I going to get experience if they require me to get experience? And for that, you probably should do stuff like undergraduate research. You probably should join a project. You probably should work on something. You have to put something, showcase that, hey, I've worked on something start to finish. I've gotten these results. I think this was very cool. And then that will hopefully get the recruiter to actually take you more seriously and think, okay, this guy is worth a shot, or this girl is worth a shot. And again, kind of like touching on what I said before, through internships or any type of experience, really, you learn more about who you are, because like right now you're in this college environment surrounded by people, and you're kind of seeing similar people every day. You're seeing same professors, same classrooms. When you take yourself out and put yourself in like a company or a lab or something outside of here, the only variable that's not changing is yourself. Everything else is changing. So this will actually help you understand who you are and what your patterns and habits and why you do some things and what you actually like and don't like, which is very important. And of course, you iterate. So once you have your internship, you might get your first job offer, hopefully, if that's what you're trying to do. And you have to consider some things, and that is like salary, company size, location, vacation time, development, all that cool stuff, what they offer. But the thing that I want you to get is don't place too much importance on, oh, I have to get the perfect job. Or like, oh, I have to get this like absolutely perfectly catered to my needs thing, and if I don't, I'm like a complete failure. No, just pick something, the most probable outcome or the most likely thing you are to enjoy, and just go with that and see how that goes. And you're not married to your first job. You could always leave and go do something else. You could always switch your entire career and do something else. And this is why I love NASA so much, because when I interned there, I met a guy and he gave a talk, and he said, I asked him, I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing a PhD, but I'm really worried, like, what if I shouldn't do a PhD? And he literally just looked at me and he said, like, do the PhD, and if you don't like the PhD afterwards, just go do something else. And I said, oh, you could do that? And he said, yes, absolutely. You could reinvent yourself whenever you want. And he said, I did my PhD in some like computer science related thing, and now I'm doing robotics, something completely different. But that PhD knowledge did not just go away, and I didn't just like switch to something where all that time was wasted. All that work I've done for my PhD helped me develop who I am, helped me develop my skills, helped me get to know myself more, and so on. And this is why this iteration loop is your personal development. It's because through doing these things, you'll learn more about yourself. And even if you don't like what you're doing, well, guess what? What you're doing is what led you to that conclusion, right? That's the thing that led you to actually figure it out, right? So it's just so beautiful. And then one very important question I want to touch on is, should you go to grad school? And because, again, STEM, grad school is kind of important to think about. You have to ask yourself some questions. And that is, do you enjoy the university environment, or you can't wait to be done? And again, one way to find out is to experience the university environment and then go work for a company. And for example, in my case, when I worked for private companies, I really didn't like it. And I was like, oh, I really like school too much. And that's probably the main reason why I went to graduate school. So that's probably something you want to consider. Another important question to ask is, can you handle additional few years of being broke, or do you need to make money urgently? And again, that's probably like a very simple thing to decide. Do you think you're ready for the workforce, or could you use more time in school? And it's kind of a very risky question to ask yourself, because you want to make sure you're not like procrastinating, but rather like you really need the time. Because for me, I had a professor in college who, I told him, hey, I'm thinking about going to grad school, and he said, well, do you know why you're doing it, or are you just buying more time? And I said, no, I'm buying more time. And he said, no, you shouldn't do it if you're buying more time. And I did it anyway to buy more time. And I think that was actually a good decision. But that's because what I wanted to do involved research, and research required me to go to graduate school. Now, had I been in a different situation, that professor would have been right, because you could go to graduate school for the sole purpose of avoiding the real world, but not actually have a plan on what you're going to end up doing there. That's probably a bad decision, unless your grad school is being paid for. Then it's probably not too good. But one very important thing to decide about graduate school is, I would encourage anybody to go to graduate school if you identify an area within your major that you really, really like and would like to learn a bit more about. For example, if you're studying physics, I'm using physics as an example, and you really like modern physics, more specifically, like, or I don't know, like let's say you're studying chemistry, and for like strange reason, you're really obsessed with like the forces that keep atoms together, which is probably a little bit of physics, but you're probably interested in the chemistry aspect of it, or you're really curious about materials, and you're like, okay, why does this material melt when this material breaks under these certain conditions? If that's something like you're super interested in, that's probably the best reason to go to graduate school, is to identify an area that you're really, really curious about, and then apply to graduate school, and then maybe like, I don't know, do a 2-year program, and see how that goes. And again, if you don't like it, you could always iterate from there on and do something else. And then finally, I think, figure out if there's a professor who's doing something that's interesting, ask them what they're doing. And then one very important question, and this was important to me, is there anything you have not accomplished in an undergrad that you want to do in grad school? And for me, that was study abroad. So actually one of the reasons why I did my master's is because I really wanted to study abroad, but because I switched my major 4 times and I took 1 semester off for an internship, and I basically barely graduated in 4 years, I had no time to do study abroad, but I really wanted to do it. So then I did a master's, and part of that was spending a semester abroad in Spain. So that's another reason why it could be a good idea to go to graduate school. However, my advice is try to do everything you want to do in undergrad, because what I did was basically kind of delay something until it was probably not ideal. But these are a lot of decisions you have to make, right? These are so many decisions, and if you were like me when I was in college, you're probably like, oh my god, I have to make these decisions right, because if I don't, I'm going to screw up, and I'm going to end up in a job that I hate, with a spouse that I don't like, and like things will just crash from there on, right? And that is probably not true, but to put yourself in the most optimal position, you have to make very clear decisions which will require you to think clearly, right? And if there's any reason why you should kind of try to step away from noise, this is the reason. It's because these are very tough decisions. Let's face it, these are not easy decisions, right? Like you're like, okay, what do I do, what do I do? And even though I promised you that when you do something and you don't like it, you could always iterate, time and energy are still being spent. So the best thing, even though failing is okay, because you're gonna learn and iterate, the optimal thing is to get it right the first time, right? And for that, my advice, you've probably heard this 500 times. There's 2 pieces of advice I will tell you. In order to think very clearly, you have to monitor the inputs that are going to your brain. And what do I mean by this? You guys are familiar with Isaac Newton, right? So when we think of Isaac Newton, we probably think of this like genius who's just like supernatural powers, just really smart, really good at physics. And while that is partially true, Isaac Newton had listed, I think, about like 14 people or like mentors that really, really helped him and inspired him to do the things he was doing. Basically, his inputs were like really smart people that did really fancy physics, and that contributed to the decisions he made. And you'll see this case many times. For example, Elon Musk. You guys probably know who that is. Very often, if you watch any of his interviews, he will tell you that what he spent a lot of his time doing is is reading books, mainly biographies, and the one he cites the most is Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin was someone who was an inventor, he was like a philosopher, he did like law stuff, he was very organized, and he was kind of like a polymath. And he's on the $100 bill, which probably, like that tells you enough. And Elon Musk studied that guy, and that was his input. And the output of the decisions that he made had that Benjamin Franklin filter in his head. And this is where this computer science term garbage in equals garbage out comes in handy, because you have to monitor what is going inside your brain. What type of information are you consuming on a day-to-day basis? And how is it contributing to the decisions you're making? Because what many people do, and this is why you should love science, because it's very objective, in computer science for a long time, what many people try to prove this statement wrong, and they try to explain that no, if you make a system so good, if you make like a computer so good, it doesn't matter if you feed it crap, you can still have a good output. But no matter what, that was never the case. The quality of the output will always depend on the quality of your input, right? So in order to have very clear decisions, you really have to monitor what kind of information goes into your brain. Now, this is why I would say use social media wisely. Now, I'm not against social media. I actually have an Instagram. I use it, although I have notifications turned off. I use it to communicate with my friends. I use it to look at funny memes, exchange things like that with my friends. But I never subscribe to anything like random, or I don't know. For example, this is why I don't use TikTok, because TikTok will shove things that you're not subscribed to in your face, and your brain cannot help but absorb it. And then that's gonna become part of your thought process, because again, garbage in equals garbage out. So if you're consuming garbage, your decisions are not gonna be clear. So make sure you're consuming quality information, and don't even make sure, just observe for a day. Take one day and just ask yourself, for the past week, what type of information have I been consuming? What type of stuff am I putting inside my brain? And just observe it and don't judge yourself. But that will probably be your biggest cue. Once you take care of this, and you're actually feeding good stuff into your brain, and you remove the noise, you block out a lot of the noise, you unsubscribe from all that crap, you turn your notifications off, unless you really need it for important things, your decision quality will be so much better. Because now you're actually able to think clearly, right? And this is probably the most important slide in the presentation, because quality decision making is subtractive, not additive. And what I mean by that is, while I am telling you to go absorb information from internships, from experiences, go try some things out, at the end of the day, once you sit down and make a decision, you actually want to be as clear as possible, and you want to eliminate things rather than add new things, right? For example, some people will say, oh, if you want to think clearly, you should meditate. That's adding something. But why don't you eliminate the stuff that are making your head messy in the first place, right? And actually go to the root cause. And that's, again, the core of the objective science. And then finally, I said finally 500 times. Finally, for this specific case, iteration needs a short-term plan, right? You're not, in order for you to iterate and go through the loop, you have to actually identify a target and apply the loop to something, right? And for that, you need a short-term plan. And I emphasize saying short-term plan because I'm really not a huge fan of people who, they're okay, in 10 years, I'm gonna do this. Well, in 10 years, we could have another pandemic and the whole economy could change or whatnot. So I'm really not a big fan of 5-year plan, 10-year plan. I really don't like that. I really am a big fan of, it's good to have a vision, a North Star of what you want to do. But more importantly, what are you doing today, this week, the next 3 months? If you focus on that and execute that very, very well, you'll be fine in 5 years. You'll be more than fine in 5 years. But if you're spending too much time thinking about, what am I going to do in 5 years, and 6 months pass by, and you're like, oh, I should do that, maybe I should not do that. And I say that because I'm talking to my previous self. This is the type of crap I used to do, where I used to sit down in my dorm in my freshman fall, and I would think, yeah, 10 years from now, maybe I'll switch. And I was not going out and doing the things that I needed to do. And until I did that, which required action and a short-term plan, things changed. So I'm going to walk you through a very brief timeline of what I actually did in college and in grad school, and hopefully apply things that are similar if you want similar results to what I have, which is internships, grad school, figuring that things out, having a job that you actually don't hate. So when I was a freshman, and this is really more towards the second half of my freshman year, my first semester I was kind of a mess. My second semester I kind of figured out that I need to pick things up, and my goal was to figure out what to do with my life, right? And then basically what to major in. So then I talked to some people in different majors. I talked to some people who said, study this, don't study that. And I said, okay. And I talked to more people who said, study that, and so on. And I kind of absorbed all that information. I iterated. And I picked a major, switched it, picked another major, switched it, and I was open to changing my major. And then basically my sophomore year, I narrowed it down to engineering, and then I said, okay, what kind of engineering should I do? So then I applied the loop again, and I went and learned about the different types of engineering. I went to clubs, I went to societies, I absorbed a lot of information, iterate, and then I picked electrical engineering. My third year, I wanted to get an internship. So again, my plan was make sure the resume is good, which means go get help with that and get people's opinions on it, and so on. I got my internship. My senior year, I actually got the internships, and I want to figure out, do I go to grad school? Do I get a job? So I reflected on my experiences. I went and I spoke to a lot of professors. I would talk to one professor, he would give me one advice. I would say, okay, and I would talk to another, and another, and another, and every time I'm iterating what I'm actually thinking about, and that led me to the decision of actually going to grad school. First year, kind of similar to undergrad. Okay, now I'm in grad school, what should I actually work on? So again, apply. I work on multiple projects where I dive into one project. I'm like, okay, this seems cool, let me try it. Nope, this is not fun, this is not fun, this is not fun. Okay, this is fun. And that's basically what worked really well and very, very high speed. Second year, I wanted to not be too stressed out, and I wanted to actually focus on myself. So I, again, started reading a lot of books about like how to actually enjoy life and things of that nature. And I dived into music a little bit. I made a music album, which you can find me on Spotify. And then third year, I wanted to make a bigger impact on the world and help people. So again, I wanted to find out people who are doing that, and I learned how they think. And I wrote a book about electrical engineering, and then I found out young people don't read books. So I gotta like figure something out. So then I made a YouTube channel. And then now I'm in a stage where I really want to figure out how to get really good at learning, how to be very efficient at learning, and how to teach other people what I know. This is why I'm doing this presentation. It's actually very selfish of me to do this, even though it seems like I'm sharing information. But what I'm doing is I'm actually relaying my thoughts back to myself in the form of teaching other people. So I hope you're enjoying this, because I actually am. But basically, using this iteration method is, in my opinion, is the only way to get to where you want to go with speed, right? And again, for me, speed is very important, like, because I'm like, I don't want to waste time. What do I gotta figure out? Okay, let me try that, let me try that, let me try that, and so on, and things happen. Now, one thing I want you to keep in mind also, like kind of mindset or like a mental frame that helped me along the way is, as you iterate and as you run into more things, especially nowadays, things are really competitive. Like, there's a lot of students in STEM. There's a lot of people trying to be engineers. There's a lot of people applying to Tesla. There's a lot of people applying to SpaceX. There's a lot of people applying to do all these things. There's a lot of people starting companies. It's really hard to get funding. It's really hard to get people to root for you. But that should never discourage you, because as things get harder and harder, that just means you have to get better skills. And as long as you have skills that other people don't have, which you will get through experience, and again, through filtering really good information that's going inside your brain, it will help you get to the next stage. And this is key, like phrase, next stage. Don't obsess over 5 years, 10 years. Next stage. What skills do I need to get me where I need to go? And that's pretty much bringing us back all the way to full circle. And basically what I have learned so far from going to all these companies, internships, basically being a STEM person for like 8 years, is do not obsess over a perfect career or a perfect life. There's no such thing. Life is messy. Disruption will happen. You will change and evolve. Think about this. You make a 5-year plan, and 2 years down the line, you run into something that changes who you are entirely. Now, what happened to your plan? And again, I'm not against planning. I plan a lot myself, but most of your energy should be spent on the short term, figuring out, okay, survive before you thrive, right? Most people I see are not surviving. They're thinking about how to thrive, but they're like a mess, you know, like you're broke and like everything is wrong in your life, but you want to change the world, which is good to have that in the back of your mind, but like figure out the short-term stuff first and then iterate your way through your long-term vision. And another way to put it is something Naval said. I really like this guy. You probably should read his book and check out some of his ideas, because he talks a lot about frameworks, and he's a very scientific person. He says, be the best in the world at what you do. Keep redefining what you do until this is true. And this, what I've experienced, is that I'm nowhere near the best in the world at what I do, but I've been very good at like figuring out what I'm definitely not going to be the best in the world at doing. But I've put my fair share of effort into it, And before I moved on to the next thing. You can't just be like, I don't want to put in the work for this, so let me just move on. Like, you actually have to try and say, okay, yeah, I really don't enjoy this, and then you move on to the next thing. And if you keep doing that, using the scientific method, using thinking, clear thinking, thinking for yourself, not just blindly following other people, not allowing crap to seep into your decision making, you'll be okay. And with that, I think we're exactly at 40 minutes. So thank you so much for listening. Anybody have questions?